Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're going to make a start. It's a great pleasure to welcome Barry Gardiner, Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. My name's Anand Menon. I run the UK in a Changing Europe, which is a Brexit think tank. So go to our website and subscribe to our newsletter. That's the end of my PR blitz. Contrary to how it looks, we're not here to play drinking games, as we seem to have lined up several glasses in front of us.
It's all water, I assure you. No gin, no vodka.
But to have the aim of this is to have what we don't have anymore on the telly or the radio, which is a slightly longer form interview. So we have a sort of more detailed conversation about politics and policy. But first, a few words about Barry. I believe that as a younger man, you harboured ambitions to join the priesthood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you kind
guilty as charged.
You kind of have, haven't you?
Yeah.
But we'll come back to that later on. You were elected as a Labour MP in 1997 and were a junior minister in the Blair years, including in the Northern Ireland office. You had the distinction of achieving the largest pro-Labour swing in the country in 2001 in your constituency.
Hey. And in 1997.
Oh, well, forgive me.
In 97 and 2000. Yeah.
And Guido Fawkes doesn't like you. He described you.
That's got to be worth a round of applause. Come on.
He described you, I think, in the 2017 election campaign as Jeremy Corbyn's media basher-in-chief. So congratulations.
Fair dues.
So, I mean, we have to start with Brexit, I'm afraid. Is it fair to say that Labour's Brexit policy has evolved significantly in the last few months, indeed the last few weeks?
I think...
You need to pull it. This is what we do to our guests.
Right.
We turn the mic off.
Good, okay. I think what we've seen is the logical working out of our policy from last year, actually. We came round at that... Yep. Is that better? Okay. Okay, this is not going to be so much as the fireplace chat, but the sort of fireplace shout.
Without the fireplace.
But without any rancour. I think it's the logical outworking of our policy from last year. What we did was we came together and we reached that composite 6 hours and said, okay, look, what we need to do is we need to try and get a resolution to this that is a way through, try and get some compromise negotiation, and if we can't do that and we can't get a general election, then we would want to go for a second public vote in which Remain would be an option. And that's what we said last year. And I think, actually, that's where we are this year. So you can say, has it evolved? Yes, it has, but it's evolved in accordance with the programme, the roadmap, if you like, that was set out by conference last year at that composite meeting.
But isn't one fundamental difference the fact that I think as recently as last March, you said that policy was to have a referendum on no deal or on a bad deal, but now policy is to have a referendum on any deal, even a Labour deal. And sure, I mean, that's quite a significant shift, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm just trying to remember where I said our policy was to have... I don't think I said that our policy was to have a referendum on no deal or a bad deal. Look, what I always thought was it would be not a genuine choice to offer the public a referendum that said, well, you can either remain or you can have a deal that everybody says is complete nonsense and rubbish. That isn't a genuine choice. And I think cards on the table, I voted to remain. I'm a Remainer. I would vote again to remain. But I've always thought it was a dishonest position of some people who campaigned to remain to then say that they wanted a referendum in which the only realistic option to vote was to vote to remain. That's not being honest with the public. It's not being honest with people. And that's why I think it's absolutely right that we've set out that what we want to try and do is to negotiate something which is a viable option, a credible position for those who, because of their political what they see as the political gains of not being in the EU, I disagree with them, but that was their view, are prepared to, as I would put it, endure the economic downside of leaving the European Union. And I think you've got to say, well, there are people who are prepared to take that hit, but you've got to give them a genuine choice that says, yes, if you leave, you'll get some of the political benefits that you sought originally, but you won't be putting the rest of your fellow citizens into penury and losing their jobs and losing the just-in-time supply chain as a result of that. And you'll protect them at work, and you'll protect environmental standards. So that's why I think you've got to, if we're going to go back to the people, which makes perfect sense. Anybody with a union background, which I take it is most of us here, know that what you do is you take a vote at the beginning, you then do your negotiation, and you come back and you say, okay, now do you accept what we've managed to negotiate or don't you? And that seems to me an honest position to take with people. So as I say, I've always been critical of those people who said they wanted to remain or that they wanted a second referendum, but actually didn't want to give people a genuine choice in that referendum.
Incidentally, if at any moment you want to wave that report around in an approving manner so people can take photos, just go right ahead. There we go.
There we go. If I have to nod my head as I do it. Okay, right.
So they could take videos.
As long as nobody actually thinks I'm advocating a no-deal Brexit. I mean, you know what the press are. They'll take a photograph of me waving something that says no-deal Brexit, and then they'll say, you see, we told you it was a... You can't win.
We'll come on to the press in a bit, but yeah. Is it fair to say that you are less worried about the democratic implications of another referendum than you were? Because you have in the past sort of expressed reservations about what a referendum might mean for democracy.
Look, I am worried about that. And right at the beginning, when I first said that I was concerned and I felt that, trying to rerun this was a really bad idea. And I said that at the beginning. I think it was on the Today programme. And I suggested that people would be really angry and upset if we did. And I can't remember which one of the presenters it was, but he said something like, so are you suggesting that there would be riots in the street? Mm. I said, no, I don't think there'd be riots in the street. But if you cut off the mechanism of democratic route to change to people, then actually civil disobedience is what you leave people with. That's the logical consequence of that. And actually I think we're seeing that, not just in the Brexit debate, but actually also in the climate debate. Because we're not getting the action quickly enough on climate through that democratic route, Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikers are taking that civil disobedience route. And, thank God they are, because it's actually put a rocket up government. But sorry, I'm digressing from the key question here. So I do think there's a real issue about going back to people and saying, you didn't get it right the first time. And that's why I was always fearful about a second referendum. But then at that stage, I thought we would have a reasonable, you can say I was foolish, I thought we might have a reasonable government position, which was to try and negotiate a deal and to compromise and to work with people to try and get it through Parliament. But what we had with Theresa May was this absolute intransigence around her red lines, this refusal to bend, even after seeing that Parliament rejected it. You'd have thought after the general election she'd have gone back to the opposition, to us, and said, look, we need to try and work together here. We need to try and get something that can work for all parties and that can bring what is clearly a huge division in our country back together. But she didn't. And because of that intransigent, then followed up with Boris Johnson saying, well, actually, I'm just going to go for no deal anyway. And let's be clear what's happened over this past couple of weeks period. Because we did not fall for the elephant trap that he set, in which by going for a general election, he could have then manipulated the date of the general election till after we'd gone out on a no deal. We've actually forced him, and not just the Labour Party, and I really do want to say that the work that we've done with the other parties and other opposition people, even within the Tory party, has been hugely positive, because it has forced him actually now to say, the only way I can do this, given what Parliament has now dictated, that I have to ask for an extension, the only way I can get this is to try and take negotiations seriously. And he really did not want to do that. But now he's been forced to do it, and he's in a really tight spot. And that's what we've managed to work through in these past few weeks. And I think that's really positive, because it's showing the government up for what they were.
Okay, I'm going to drag you back to the question now. I take your point, and your point is the Conservative government since the referendum have been pretty appalling at dealing with, well, anything but Brexit in this case. Yeah. And so circumstances are materially different when it comes to whether or not we should have another referendum, because at the start you could reasonably expect them to be competent. Yeah. Okay. Even if that is the case, there's going to be a problem for the party, isn't there, when it comes to Labour Leave voters who vote Leave again in another referendum, if they end up losing and the majority is less, and the winning side has less than 17 million votes, say, so we've got a smaller turnout than we had in 2016, which is perfectly possible. What do you say to those people?
Anand, you're making the argument that I made at the time, 18 months, 2 years ago. That was exactly the argument that I said. I said, look, what happens if it flips? People are going to feel really, really aggrieved. And that's why I think the only way of resolving this is actually to say, well, now you can see exactly what it would mean to leave in a credible, viable way, and we have to try and get a resolution to this and move on. And that's why I've always wanted to see some compromise here, because actually, who would have thought that, well, you'd have always thought that the Brexit Party and Boris Johnson and Tories were on the extreme at one end with their no deal. You've now got the Liberal Democrats at the extreme on the other end, who are simply saying, not only revoke, but are actually saying, if there were a second referendum and it voted to leave again, she says she still wouldn't take any notice of it. Now, these are really extreme positions which are simply failing to respect our fellow citizens. And we are in the middle, Jeremy Corbyn government right in the centre of British politics, trying to hold the country together. But it's so important that we are saying, look, we need to reconcile. We need to actually heal the division and move on. And the only way of doing that is to be straight with people and to offer them a realistic alternative. Yes, it would be leave. Yes, it would be leave. We would leave the institutions, we'd leave the treaties, but it wouldn't do the economic damage. So, and on the other hand, if you want to remain, you vote to remain. And then hopefully, because everybody's had that opportunity to have that final say, we can then say, okay, well, we've respected each other, we've listened to each other, and we've actually voted on the final. So if you don't mind, let's just dig into that policy a little bit more, because I think, yes, taking the centre ground makes a bit of sense here, but your position needs to be credible. So
What would a Labour withdrawal agreement or Brexit deal do that Mrs May's deal didn't? How would it be different?
Okay. Well, the key elements we've set out, we would have a permanent customs union, a new customs union, but a permanent customs union in which the UK had a say on the trade negotiations that we conducted within that customs union. It would be ensuring that we protected rights at work. It would be ensuring that, in effect, the benefits that we've gained over the past, decades with the social chapter were retained, and it would be ensuring that we made the environmental protections inviolable. Now, when we went into the negotiations with the government, with Theresa May's government, that was the basis upon which we did that. And Jeremy, in fact, last year at party conference, it was in his party conference speech last year, said, we will help you to try and get a deal through Parliament as long as it has those three elements. And even after the first and the second rejection, she wouldn't, but eventually after the extension, she came back and said, okay, let's negotiate. And those negotiations then took place, and let's be honest, there was movement that I, for one, would not have expected. They did move on rights at work, and they were prepared to put that into legislation. We saw the wording that they were prepared to put. And I didn't expect them to do that, but they did. They did not do that on environmental protections. They said that they were prepared to do it, but they didn't actually show us the writing and say this is what would be in legislation to guarantee it. And when it came to a permanent customs union, which we have to say, absolutely there was no movement at all. So again, I go back to that point about the Conservative government's intransigence. I believe that there was a deal which Parliament could have got through, and you will remember that at that stage, there was a reluctance to say, yes, we have to go back to the people, because we were trying to get a compromise that could go through Parliament and that would have been something that we believe genuinely would have tried to bring all those strands together. Their intransigence absolutely stopped that, and I regret that. But I think now the only way of doing this in a way that will heal the division in the country, people just aren't listening to each other. They're listening to each other only so that they can better contradict the other person. And what we need is we need to say, okay, tell me what it is about, sovereignty that you feel was lost as part of the European Union. And on the other side, we need people saying, well, look, I don't work in an industry where the just-in-time supply chain is relevant or important. So tell me what your fears are about jobs and the economy on that. And we're not engaging with the real issues that have prompted people on either side. And I think that is our role as the Labour Party. We want to be respectful of each other. We're a political party. Of course we have differences, but we have to be able to engage, to listen, to try and accommodate people and to move forward together. Constantly, we march under a banner that says unity is strength, but then where's the bloody unity? Let's try and come together in a way that enables not just our party to move forward, but the country to move forward. Because ultimately, that's what we're here for. We're here to serve them.
So, bask in your applause. Just one final thing on the Labour deal before I want to come on to this referendum question, because there are lots of things about it I don't really understand, to be honest. But you were very famously caught on tape saying that Labour's 6 Brexit tests were bollocks.
I actually simply said...
We're after the watershed.
Yeah. You haven't got the quote exactly right, but I won't labour the point.
But it is basically bollocks to say that you can leave the European Union and have the exact same benefits as you would have in the single market and the customs union.
That is actually what I did say. I said, look, take test number 1, exact same benefits. And then I said, bollocks. You know, you can't leave any club and still expect the benefits of membership. And so, yeah, publicly, I had always tried to, you know, I believe in collective responsibility. I never leak. I do never, ever leak, because I hate it when people leak. I think it's just discourteous to your colleagues. You can't hold a proper discussion. So yes, fight your corner, you know, in shadow cabinet or in private discussions. But that I had believed was a private discussion. I was very upset that somebody leaked it, but it did display the fact that I was articulating in private what I think a lot of people were thinking in public.
Yes, I think you were. How could you possibly get the public to support a Labour Brexit deal if the Labour leader himself can't commit to campaigning for it in a referendum?
Oh, very easily. Very easily. You mean if we were to negotiate the deal with the EU and then say, right, here it is, you either vote for this or you vote to remain. Because it's not about Jeremy Corbyn, and it's not about Barry Gardiner, it's not about what we as politicians think, and it's not about what we as a party think. It's about us as a party in government facilitating the country to reach a conclusion and to accept it. And that's why you know, people say, well, surely you would have to have a view on it. Look, colleagues across the party have different views. Are we really going to, do you think the British public are going to be fooled that, you know, on the one hand, you know, Emily Thornberry and on the other hand, Ian Lavery are actually somehow suddenly all united around it just because we say that's the case? Of course not. Let's be honest with people. Let's say, look, different people, different politicians, just like the rest of the country, have different views on this. And that's why it's not about us imposing a view or imposing a deal. It's about us enabling the country to have a deal and to decide upon it and to resolve the matter and move on.
But isn't it odd that the leader of the party is the only person who doesn't seem to have a view on this?
No, I don't think so at all, because look, Jeremy has his views. He's got his views on the European Union, Brexit. If you remember back to when he was on, I think it was Sophie Ridge, she said, but you know, you've always opposed the European Union. And he said, no, absolutely not. I've always opposed the neoliberal economics of the European Union, but I've always supported the social chapter. And, you know, and that's what we as a party have had to grapple with. So Jeremy, you know, has publicly said he voted to remain, he campaigned to remain, and what he would do in a future referendum, I don't know, you can ask him, but I believe he said that he would want to remain, or probably, I think he used the word probably. But what the leader of the party or what politicians want isn't what's important. We are there to facilitate the country and to ensure that we arrive at something which is economically viable and democratically sustainable. And those are the two fundamental principles that we've been caught between in this whole Brexit process. Because, you know, we campaign to remain and reform as the Labour Party. We've never thought that the EU was a perfect institution, but we believed it was better to stay in it and to reform it. That was what we campaigned on at the referendum. We lost the referendum. So what do? Do you just say, well, it doesn't matter that we lost the referendum. It doesn't matter that 17.4 million people who voted against. No, you've got to take that into account. And therefore, what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance those two competing principles that we have as politicians that say you've got to do what's in the best interests of your public for jobs and the economy and their well-being economically, and at the same time you've got to respect their democratic right to decide on their own future. Can I just say, before we started, we were talking about question time, and Anand said, the trouble with question time is, if you get a round of applause, it's usually because you've made a cheap remark. So please stop applauding.
Not with you people.
Otherwise, he's just going to accuse me of making cheap remarks.
It's a very specific audience, that and this. Are you not concerned? I mean, you said it's not about what individual politicians think. Are you not concerned that the Brexit issue at this conference is turning into a bit of a beauty pageant for prospective leaders of the party, and that is what is going on with people taking very strong positions, very, very striking clothes, whatever it might be, that actually this is a rather unseemly jostling going on?
I'm not going to get into that. I think that question is inviting me to criticise colleagues, and I won't do it.
Look at that, another one. Sadiq Khan said...
Another cheap shot, obviously.
That was a refusal to give a cheap shot. That's even worse. Sadiq Khan said earlier today that MPs should be whipped, in inverted commas, because it would be not in Parliament, to support Remain in a referendum. What do you think of that?
Look, I disagree. Obviously, I disagree. And it will be for the party, it will be for you, the delegates, to decide what as a party we do. All I would say to you is, let me try and explain this, how passionately I feel about this in another way. John Stuart Mill, that great libertarian philosopher at the end of the 19th century, was asked why he opposed the universal suffrage. And he said he was against the universal suffrage because he thought that people would come to regard the vote as an expression of their own personal preference rather than as a public responsibility. And actually, I think he was wrong to think that they didn't already use it as an expression of their own personal preference. Back in the 19th century, they certainly did. But that was what he said. And all I would say to every delegate here is when you exercise your vote on the conference floor on this issue, please do not do it as an expression of your own personal preference. Exercise it as if it is your public responsibility. You're taking a decision for the wider community. And that's really so important because we have to get this right.
I've just been watching the Cameron years and been reminded of the bitterness of the referendum within the Conservative Party and what it did to them. Are you not slightly concerned, given the strength of feeling that exists inside the Parliamentary Labour Party on both sides of this debate, that if a Labour Party were to be in power and held a referendum, it would do the same thing to a Labour government that it did to that Conservative government, which is basically tear it apart?
Look, for 40 years, you've seen the Conservatives try and put sticking plaster over the schism in their party. And that's what the referendum was about. I've said before that one of my biggest regrets in Parliament is that I did not stand up at that point and say, how can we seriously be trying to decide the constitutional future of our country for the next 40 years on the basis of whether Mrs. Jones pops her clogs on the 22nd or the 24th of June? A 50% plus one referendum was not a way of deciding the settled will of the people for a generation.
But it was the rule for the 75 one.
Indeed, and established precedent made it extremely difficult then to exercise common sense, in my view. So I understand why we got into that position, but it was the wrong position. But you asked about potential schism in the Labour Party over this.
Or in a Labour government.
In a
in
Labour
power.
government, if we hold a referendum on this, I think if we give people the freedom within the party, not whip them, but give them the freedom within the party to set out clearly what their own position is, their own views, to campaign as they wish, then at the end of the day, people have to say, well, nobody gagged me, nobody forced me to obey a party line that I totally disagreed with, and as a result of that, I am prepared to live with the result. It's honest, it's grown-up politics, and it's about saying, okay, I had my shot, I wasn't able to persuade people. If a second referendum went against Remain, I would simply say, okay, I accept that. I will vote Remain, I would campaign to Remain. But I would accept if a second referendum said, no, we still want to leave,
but
as long as it's on that shape deal that we tried to negotiate.
that's not quite the question. I mean, the question was more during the heat of a campaign, and my God, those campaigns generate a lot of heat. The danger, surely, is that government colleagues would be at each other's throats. You'd be debating against those colleagues. It all got very, very personal with Cameron's government, indeed.
Look, I see how the question was framed, and I hadn't taken that on board. I often disagree with my colleagues. All of us do. All of us in this party disagree. You know, we're all members of our ward. We're all members of our CLP. What do? We debate things. We disagree with each other. We pass resolutions. You know, we second them. We oppose them. We're a political party. That's meat and drink for a political party. But the point is, at the end of it, what do we do in our CLP? What do we do in our branch? We still go down to the pub and have a drink with each other. We still have our socials. Because ultimately, what is it that binds us together in this party? It's not that we all agree with each other, except on the fact that we believe that the Labour Party is the best vehicle for progressive social change that this country has ever seen. And it always will be.
I had to roll my eyes a bit at the thought of Tom Watson and Len McCluskey sharing a beer during this conference, but we'll leave that to one side for the moment. We're going to have an election. We're going to have an election relatively soon, it looks like. And you talked about the dangers of Boris Johnson messing about with the timing of an election to take us out with no deal. Isn't the logic of the Labour position far more, well, in a way, savvy than that, which is quite simply the best time to fight Boris Johnson is after his government's had to go to Brussels and ask for the extension he said he would never do under any circumstances. Isn't that the real reason for making him wait? And it's a great reason for making him wait. It's a perfectly sensible political reason. But why don't you just say that?
I don't know if you've seen that YouTube clip of the Australian Parliament when, and I can't remember who the Prime Minister was and who the Leader of the Opposition was, but look it up anyway. And the Prime Minister is saying to the Leader of the Opposition, why don't you precipitate a general election? Why don't you precipitate a general election? And he comes back and he says, I'll tell you why I don't want to precipitate, because I want to do you slowly. And I want to do Boris Johnson slowly. Right?
That's going to get clipped, you know that, don't you? And it's going to go horribly wrong.
It's not working. Her Wi-Fi isn't working.
I'm just saying, you shouldn't have said that for your own good.
The Prime Minister that couldn't get a single law through Parliament. The Prime Minister that betrayed his own key promise. The Prime Minister that prorogued Parliament for 5 weeks. And let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says about it before we go down that road any further. The Prime Minister that can't get his Queen's speech through. The Prime Minister who lies barefacedly in Whipps Cross Hospital. I mean, to me...
You forgot the brother.
Well, absolutely. But I want him to be seen for what he is by the British public. And the longer they see him trapped in government, incapable to do anything, incapable to deliver on his promises, having to eat his words about taking us out without a deal, or having to actually be the government and the Prime Minister that refuses to implement the law. That's how I want the British public to see him. And when they do, that's the time that we should defeat him in a general election.
So you ran a fantastic campaign in 2017 in many ways, and one of the great things and really exciting things about it was that very profound sense of insurgency that characterised it. Can that trick be pulled off a second time, do you think?
I think in politics very few things can be just repeated and replicated. I think we have to have a new urgency to the offer that we will make to the British public, and I think that's what this week is and should be about. It has to not be about personalities. It has to be about policies. You know, look at today. John Ashworth's announcements, billions of pounds for our health service. You take that out on the doorstep. You talk to people about their experience at A&E, their experience of waiting times, their experience of social care, their experience of their elderly parents coming out of hospital or not being able to because there is no social care provision in place for them. Talk to people about those things. Talk in narrative terms. Talk about the human misery that this government is causing. And that's the way that we will take people with us. Yeah, you're right. Last time there was this sort of, the Labour Party can't possibly do it. They're 25 points behind in the polls. And suddenly things changed. Things changed. And that was a very unique set of circumstances. So it's not about trying to pull that off again. It's about trying to, in a very direct way, tell the stories that are going to relate to the real problems and the real issues and the real suffering that people have in this country. And if we do that, of course we'll win.
In the event that we end up with another hung parliament, and I mean, God knows what's going to happen, but in the event we end up with another hung parliament, Labour might be the biggest party, but reliant on, say, Lib Dem and SNP votes, would you personally be happy to pay the price of another Scottish independence referendum for that support? Purely personally, I'm not asking for a party position, just...
No, look, I would not go into any alliance or make any deal. I believe that what you do is, in that situation, I hope we'd get a majority, but if we were a minority government, we should govern as a minority government. It's tough. It's really tough governing as a minority government because you've got to pick those areas where you can get a coalition of people behind you on those individual issues, legislate them and take them through Parliament. And that is the toughest way to govern.
You could just prorogue for a few years.
Yeah, but then you get nothing done, as we've seen. But I think that's the right way to do it. It's not to make any deals. It's not to try and create alliances. Look what happened with the 2010 general election when the Tories and Liberals went into that horrible, austerity alliance. It's not the way to do it. Try and govern on your principles, because if you don't, and this is what I've got against alliances like that, and that's sort of the impetus behind PR and so on that often leads to those, is politicians get very lazy, and they go on the doorstep and they say, this is what we're promising to do for you. And they go back in 4 or 5 years' time and they say, hang on, you didn't do what you promised last time. Oh, yeah, but actually that was because we were in a coalition with so-and-so and they wouldn't let us. And it's the easiest thing for politicians then to promise anything that they think will get themselves elected, because they know that at the end of the day they can always blame their coalition partners for not delivering it.
But
That's not what we should do.
Isn't the political lesson of 2010 that if you are the bigger party in a coalition, you can basically chew up the smaller party and spit them out, having used them as lobby fodder to get what you wanted done? I mean, that's the cynical lesson, isn't it? I mean, that must be the lesson the Tories drew from the Lib Dems, is do it.
Yeah. Anand, I'm not a cynic.
I am. I'm
I-
sorry.
I believe that you set out what you want to do. You then, in Parliament, you say, okay, this was our policy. This is what we promised on social care. We're now going to try and implement that. And let whoever dares oppose that policy and show themselves to be against it to the public. Because we believe it's popular. We believe it's what people want. We believe it's going to make a difference to people's lives. That's the honest way of doing it. Let's do it.
Okay. I just want to talk briefly about the sort of state of the country in terms of political divisions, and sort of two things about this. Firstly, is there anything we can do in the event that we had another referendum to avoid it being as polarising and divisive as the first one, or is that just something we're going to have to deal with?
Okay, shall I say it? Okay. I was going to say, you mean short of locking up Nigel Farage? No, you know,
I'm not sure that will cure division necessarily.
no, but it might take some of the vitriol out of it. That was a joke. That really was a joke. Please don't anybody. You know, I can just see it. You know, oh God.
He wants to do Boris Johnson slowly as well. So you know, while we're here.
Look. I think it's not just about the referendum. Jeremy talked about a kinder politics. And I think that we have, as I said earlier, lost that capacity to listen and engage with people. And I tell you, I'll go off at a tangent, but it is apposite, I think. I was at a primary school in my constituency, and it's a new primary school attached to a secondary school. And I said to the headmaster, I said, tell me, what does the school motto mean? Munus Priori. And rather embarrassingly, he didn't know. And he said, well, it was really the secondary school's motto. We just inherited it. So I went away and I looked it up. And it's duty before rights. Munus priori. Duty before rights. And I think in this country, we've gone wrong in our assertion of our rights before, and God knows, rights are absolutely important, right? Human rights, equality, these are fundamental values that we in the Labour Party have. But in society, I think we've got to a point where individuals are now more insistent about their rights than they are concerned about their duties and obligations to society as a whole. And I think one of the things that the Labour Party has always been about is society as a whole. It is community. It is about building that sense of solidarity. And that's why we took it so personally when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. But society has fallen into that Thatcherite trap, I think, of we're all individuals, and therefore we can assert our rights before we actually think, well, hang on, what about our obligations? What about our duties? What about the rights of other people around us and how those rights interrelate and interact? So when it comes to that, I fall very much on the duty side of the equation, on the munus priori. And I think we need to get back to that understanding in our discourse our political discourse, because I think that's the way in which we really do entrench those Labour values, and I think it's the way in which society comes to respect the rights of others.
Do you think the broadcast media are biased against the Labour Party?
Look, let me put it this way. The job of the media is a different job to the job of the politician. The job of the media is to hold politicians to account, to ask them tough questions, and actually a lot of it is to entertain people. You know, and we were talking about question time before. I always remember that lovely phrase at the end of Pride and Prejudice, and it's where Mr. Bennet turns around and he says, "After all, what are we but to make sport for our neighbours and to laugh at them in our turn?" And, you know, we have to remember that the media is there as entertainment. And people like laughing at the follies of each other, and they like it when politicians trip up. And so any media engagement with politicians is about trying to catch us out, trying to chop us off at the knees, trying to do us down. That's fine. Our job as politicians is to try and get our message across to the public. It's to try and use the media for what we want, which is not to entertain people or you know, it's actually to present our program and what we want to do in government. And I think if we actually understand that we've got different jobs to do here, then, you know, I think politicians would stop bitching about the media. I don't always think that it's fair treatment, but what's the point of bitching about it? You know, they've got their job to do, and maybe the reason that I think it wasn't fair treatment is because they were focused much more on entertaining their viewers at that time or their listeners at that time, and tripping me up and making me look stupid was part of what they needed to do as their job. Let's just respect that we've got different objectives, different jobs, and get on with it and engage with each other professionally.
But you've accused the BBC of peddling fake news in the past, haven't you?
Did I do that?
Yes.
What was that about?
It was an Emily Garnier report. I can remember the report. I can't remember exactly. I can find it out for you and tell you. But I mean, it just strikes me as dangerous. We're in a situation now where the government is attacking Remainer judges. The opposition's attacking fake news from the public broadcaster, and it just gives me pause that actually some of the institutions of our liberal democracy should be treated with slightly more caution and respect.
Well, I totally agree with that. It doesn't mean that if I believe that a journalist on occasion is actually, you know, presenting things as facts which aren't facts, I shouldn't challenge it. Of course, it's right to do that. But I don't have an assumption that the media are biased against me. So yes, maybe on occasions I'll say, I'm sorry, that's not true. You know, I'll disagree with people, an interviewer who presents something. That's fine. That's just establishing what the parameters are. But I don't have an assumption that the media is biased. No, I don't. I think just let's take the media as it comes, rough with the smooth, treat them professionally, do your job as a politician, which is to try and get out our message about what we want to do in government and why it's going to transform people's lives in this country, and let's get that message across as best we can.
Okay. Just got, go on, do the little clap if you want.
No.
Just got one specific question on Northern Ireland, which is the current government has been criticised, and many would say completely rightly so, for not at all being a neutral broker when it comes to Northern Ireland in the Brexit talks because of their dependence on the DUP, not least. Could Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister be a neutral broker and seen as a neutral broker on Northern Ireland?
Yes, I think he could. Yes, absolutely.
Despite historical associations, despite a lack of trust from one side in the Northern Irish debate?
Look, there has been conflict in the island of Ireland for, 400 years?
Mm-hmm.
And how did we resolve that conflict? we resolve that conflict ultimately by sitting down and talking to people. What's the worst thing that Jeremy was accused of doing in relation to Northern Ireland? Sitting down and talking to people. You know, that is what enabled us to reach the Good Friday Agreement. Listening to people, taking on board their concerns, listening not to refute, but actually to understand what the grievances were in those communities. You know, as you said at the beginning, I was a minister, a direct rule minister in Northern Ireland. I was actually, today's debate was reminding me of it. I actually tried to put an end to the 11 plus in Northern Ireland. I united both communities against me. You know, it was just, that was a real tough gig, that one, I tell you, because I wanted to. Well, actually, in fairness, I was simply carrying out what Martin McGuinness, who had been the education minister before we went back to direct rule, had actually said he wanted to do. It was the policy. But, you know, it has to be that people listen genuinely, that they try and understand what somebody else is saying, and they try and take on board the things that are more difficult for they themselves to answer. And think, okay, well, how do I move forward with this person? How do I engage with them and move forward? That's what we did in Northern Ireland. And it was the genius of Mo Mowlam that managed that. It really was. You know, and a lot of other people. But it was that ability to show that you listened as if you cared and that you did care about what they were saying. And so, of course, someone like Jeremy, who has spent a lifetime listening to other people, people who, you know, he may not have been particularly comfortable with, maybe people that, you know, he had huge sympathy for, but people who were pariahs by somebody else, and saying, you know, I'm not going to treat you as a pariah. I'm going to engage with you as a human being. I'm going to try and understand your point of view, and I'm going to try and reconcile that point of view either with mine or with somebody else's. That's what honest brokers do.
Right, we have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to ask you 3 questions.
Just a minute, eh?
So, yeah, exactly. So the first is...
See how long I can prevaricate without saying yes, no,
No,
or
but the last 2 are really good, so you've got to go fast.
Deviation.
Would you like a greater emphasis on climate change in the next manifesto than there was in the last? Good. Okay, thank you very much. Do you see yourself as a future leader of the Labour Party?
God, no.
And finally, we're doing this with Emily Thornberry day after tomorrow, I think. What should I ask her?
Anything you like.
Thank you very much. Barry, thank you for putting up with me.
Thanks for your time.
Sorry, I have to rush, but let's catch up for coffee back in London.
Yeah, that's good.
All right.